Can you share about your experience as you were exploring Kabbalah and coming, to this place that captured your attention, that was giving you answers, guidance, whatever, this charismatic character? What was the process? What pulled you in? What did you feel? What were you thinking of?
So it was an interesting time in my life, and like to be quite honest, a lot of the people that I spoke to that found the Kabbalah Center or found things like that were coming from a deep place of lack. And on some level, I don't know if I was coming from a place of lack. I mean, something was missing, but also it was an interesting time in my life. When I first found Kabbalah itself, the wisdom, I was between 15 and 16. And I think my first day in the Kabbalah Center, I think I was 17, maybe a young 17. And prior to that, I had, grew up once again, superficial town, and it was very hard for me to find my place and find my tribe. But around the age of 14, I really did find a place and a tribe that I felt an affinity with. I became enmeshed in the underground hip hop culture scene of South Florida. Um, and it's important to note that, so whether it's things as complex and ancient as Judaism or Christianity or Islam, when you go to different towns and different villages at different times and places, you'll find that there's different cultures that emerge around these things. And it just so happened that in South Florida at the time, there was an interesting culture around hip hop that I just somehow accidentally fell into. And a lot of it shaped even the way I approached my spirituality and Kabbalistic ventures before I even knew that I was. So, 14, I started breakdancing. And, slowly but surely, my friends went from being people more from my hometown, which were typically more of Jewish origin, like myself, typically more wealthy families with very similar kind of backgrounds. And slowly but surely, I was thrust into this culture with Asians, Latins, blacks, and people from all different cultures and backgrounds, but all participating in art. Dancers, painters, singers, musicians, DJs, and I really fell in love with that community. There was, I think, a lot in that community that really was home. So there wasn't necessarily, everything wasn't crumbling around me. If anything, things were great. I lived in an affluent area. I had food on the table. I didn't have problems in the typical sense that many people would have problems at that age. My problem, if there was a problem, was that I was looking for an ideal. I remember since a very young age being really mesmerized also by time, how limited it is, and this is my one lifetime and I don't want to waste it. And I took that extremely seriously as a young kid. I just remember thinking, like, if I'm going to live one life, I want to live my ideal life. And for whatever reason, it wasn't from anybody around me influencing, it wasn't from family, it wasn't from friends. For some reason at that age, the most ideal life, the most elevated life, the most significant life was a life of the most complete renunciation. So I eventually, um, slowly but surely, and even in the hip hop culture around me, it was always introduced like there's five elements of hip hop. There's b-boying, which is breakdancing. There's DJing. There's graffiti, and there's rap. And then the fifth one they always said was knowledge. And it was kind of cool to like find and I even had a few friends. Most of them were more just into painting or dancing or playing an instrument. But I did have one friend among them who was Lou, and we would also just get together and talk knowledge and ideas, and it was so fascinating and interesting. What ended up happening with me, and part of it is that I'm very extreme, and I have a capacity. Although at this point it's very different now. I'm kind of wide ranged in my seeing, but throughout my life, I always had the ability to focus, narrow in. So if it was dancing, I mean, when I started dancing, I was dancing 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, every day. And I was training and I was methodical and I was trying to get better. When I started rapping, same thing, hours a day, getting better, getting better, getting better. Always believing that, my input would eventually lead to output. When I found the knowledge aspect in Kabbalah, it kind of just of its own accord started to dominate everything else. And it became the most significant. It became the most important to me. Um, I think that was important for my journey, but I also think there was something very narrow minded about that. There was something safe about that. When I entered the center, slowly but surely over those mainly 7 years where I was completely immersed, but it was really 10 years, 3 years a student, 7 years working there. Um, Slowly but surely, I stopped dancing entirely. I stopped rapping entirely. I barely listened to music in the Kabbalah Center. I remember there was a few years there was a piano fucking next door. I didn't touch it because I was so interested in hours of Zohar, hours of Talmud, hours of Midrash. So it's like once my mind got fixated that this is the most important, everything else kind of dropped, which kind of sucked because during that time I lost many of those very sincere, raw parts of myself. Um, we'll talk maybe like later, like when I left the center, that was the first thing I did is I went back to the arts because it was the only way to kind of get back in touch with some of my natural instincts again.